Hello everybody, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're going to be doing another first look at a new game which has recently just come out, and this is going to be a DLC pack for a very familiar friend of ours. The Order of Battle series has had a new campaign or a new DLC come out. That DLC is the conclusion of a three-part series of DLCs, which put you in charge of the Wehrmacht during the major campaigns in Europe. The game that we're talking about today is the DLC Order of Battle Endsieg, or I guess Final Victory or something to that effect. I'm not quite sure the literal translation, but it basically means the end of the campaign, the end of the war in this DLC pack. So this is the third DLC in this series. The Krieg series started with Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg focused on the early battles in the German invasions of Europe, so it looked at Poland, it looked at Norway, it looked at the Low Countries and France. The second, and then the beginning of the invasion of Russia. The second DLC in this series looked at the sort of when the tide started to turn, and that particular one was Order of Battle Panzerkrieg, which again looked at sort of the 1942, 1943, early 1943 campaigns in mostly Russia. I don't know if there was anything outside of Russia, but I think it was exclusively in Russia in that particular DLC. And Endsieg is looking at the final campaigns. So it is looking at the both Russian and Western fronts in the years 1943, 1944, and 1945. As has been true for the entire Blitzkrieg and Panzerkrieg and Endsieg series, these battles allow you to carry your force over from DLC to DLC. So if you start with Blitzkrieg, you can carry your forces over to Panzerkrieg. If you fight with Panzerkrieg, you can then carry that core force over to Endsieg and sort of have this battlefield of heroes, if you will, throughout the war. Additionally, one other thing which I found interesting is the North African DLC, which came out not that long ago. I think that was actually more recent than Panzerkrieg, but I'm not sure, which was Sandstorm. Also allows you to take your core that you build up in the Africa core and bring them into the Endsieg campaign, which again is interesting and different, but I think that's kind of a neat linkage between these DLC packs. Now, the video that you're going to see here in front of you today is going to be my first impressions of Endsieg. I'm going to be fighting the second battle in the campaign. So the first battle is actually being fought in and around the Donetsk or Donbass as the Russians begin their counteroffensive immediately following the Battle of the Battle of Kursk. And now we're going to be looking at the Krakow region. So the Russians are going to be launching a counteroffensive here in August of 1943 to attempt to retake the strategic city of Krakow. Now, we did win the first battle, the Donetsk battle around the Donbass, and we achieved a secondary objective, which was destroying 10 Russian tanks or more, which means that in this battle, that little pin in the map means in this battle the Russian armor is going to be less experienced than they otherwise would. So this game, as a reminder, has these primary objectives which you need to accomplish to win, and then it has secondary objectives which, if you accomplish them, either sort of change the battle you're currently fighting in, so they might cause the enemy to stop attacking or slow their attacks, or in an alternative scenario, it has carryover impacts. So in this case, the objective was to destroy more than 10 enemy tanks. We destroyed more than 10 enemy tanks, and as a result of this next battle, the Russians are going to be suffering from that. Actually, it might be the remaining battles in this campaign. I'm not quite sure, but I think it might have some additional sort of carryover impacts. Now, for this first video, I'm not going to be doing a full-blown series. First off, Order of Battle is a game that's been out a long time. My channel has covered it quite extensively, so I'm not going to be doing a full-blown look at every single battle in this campaign. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this battle, which is the second battle in the campaign. Again, I won a victory in the first battle of the campaign. But while we're kind of looking through the briefing and as we're kind of looking across the map, I do want to tell you a little bit more about Endsieg. So, as I said, it's the third in the Krieg trilogy. I find it interesting that it's called the Krieg trilogy when this one does not have the word Krieg in it at all, unlike Blitzkrieg and Panzerkrieg. But the DLC adds 16 battles, so it's actually the largest, or one of the largest DLCs for Order of Battle. The battles cover the aftermath of the Battle of Kursk, so basically it starts in the fall of 1943 until the German counteroffensive in 1944, and also, I believe, beyond that. There's like some follow-on battles after the Ardennes as Germany attempts to win the war. There are 60 new unit types that are added to the game, so the way this series works is the 1943 battles have very different units than the 1944 and 45 battles, so the game adds new unit types to the game, both ground and air forces of not just Germany but Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Players do have access to very late war equipment, so the Tiger wasn't new, but the Tiger II was new. The Sturm Tiger and additional things like the Me-262 fighter jet, and a wide range of other types of units. There are some new specializations, so the campaign involves a specialization tree where you can get various bonuses or perks as you win battles. You earn specialization points, which you can use to kind of alter the tech tree of your nation as the campaign continues. This DLC adds 6 new specializations, which apparently include Panzer Lair, which gives you elite Panzer units, or advanced German production that gives you access to a new type of super heavy tank, and a wide range of other options there. Now, while there are 16 battles in Endsieg, there's really only one optional battle, I guess I would put it. The 16 battles are broken out into a couple of different phases. The first 4 battles in here, actually the first 5 battles in here, deal with sort of the Russian counteroffensives in 1943 and into 1944. The 5th battle, 6th battle is Vizima, which opens up a potential branch. So that's a battle that occurs in 1944, and if you win that as the Germans, and that's still on the Russian front, that's battle number 6, I guess. If you win that battle, in a minor victory, it sends you to Anzio. If you win a major victory, it sends you to Moscow. So basically, 6 battles in, there's a turning point in the campaign that allows you to either launch another assault on Moscow, or you end up getting shifted west to counter the Allied invasions in Italy at the Battle of Anzio. If you win a major victory at Moscow, then you immediately move into the Western Front in Paris. If you only win a minor victory, then you also head to Anzio. So minor victories in either case get you to Anzio, in which case winning the Battle of Anzio and a major victory, I guess, gets you to Falaise. I'm not quite sure what a minor victory does. It doesn't really... I'm looking at this sort of graphic that shows the campaign and how it breaks out. It doesn't really explain that. There's no D-Day scenario. When you do get back to the Western Front, either after Anzio or Moscow, you basically go immediately into the Falaise pocket. So essentially, I'm assuming it's basically telling the story of, hey, you're being brought west to try and rescue the situation. The Allies have landed in Normandy. They're breaking out, and your troops are being raced west, either after concluding the Russian campaign with a victory at Moscow, or coming directly up from Anzio. In either case, you are brought in to try and rescue the situation. You fight the Battle of Falaise, the Falaise pocket, however you pronounce that. And then you move on to the Battle of Paris and Market Garden. So it kind of follows the historical battles in Europe. After Market Garden, you go to the Battle of Aachen, the Hohen-Glenwald, which is sort of the Black Forest region in Germany. And then immediately into the Ardennes counteroffensive, so the Battle of the Bulge. After the Ardennes counteroffensive, these historical scenarios end, and you go into a counterattack to try and take Antwerp, and potentially, I'm assuming, another Dunkirk-type battle at Calais, where you're trying to presumably wipe out the Allied forces. If you win Calais in 1945, then I'm assuming it basically says, hey, you destroyed the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are ready at Moscow, you destroyed the Russians, and therefore the Germans win the war. That would be my assumption of the way the campaign plays out. The one thing I do find relatively interesting in this game is that there is no real dynamism in here. I mean, these are all pretty much scripted. The only sort of battle where your results impact if you fight a different battle is Anzio. You know, there's Vizima, which decides whether you fight in Anzio. Then there's Moscow, which decides whether you fight in Anzio. And then from Anzio, you go straight to the Western Front in France. So I'm not really sure, you know, why the game treats it that way. Maybe the campaign, you know, there's not... I think this is one of these inherent weaknesses as I'm kind of purchasing through my units and getting my army set up here. I think one of the inherent weaknesses of this type of a campaign is when people are playing this kind of a DLC, it's like, all right, I want to play the historical battles. I want to play, you know, the Russian counteroffensives in 1944. Or I want to play the, you know, historical battles of Anzio, of Market Garden, of Aachen, of the Battle of the Bulge. So when you build a game like this, the challenge that people want to see the battles that they know about, they want to fight the history. But the premise of this type of a campaign is that you can have alternate history and you can have you know, non-historical results. Well, how do you balance a historical results against you know, the actual battles? And I think that really comes into challenge, into sort of a culmination here. So in the Blitzkrieg battles, because again, it comes down to the fact that you're playing as the Germans. In the Blitzkrieg DLC, it didn't really matter. You know, you could say a minor victory might cause you to go from Poland straight to France, whereas a major one lets you to go to Norway. But both campaigns were historical campaigns that the German army fought in. Likewise, if you won the Battle of France, depending on how you won it, you could either go to a invasion of England as a hypothetical sea line, or you could go into, you know, the Balkan campaign. One historical, the other a very clear hypothetical that would have resulted from maybe a more aggressive and more effective German success in 1940. There are all of these known quantities. The challenge is, and it starts, I think, with Panzerkrieg, but it really becomes apparent in Endsieg, is that once the Germans are losing, but you're continuing to play this game as the Germans, the question is this: do you make the choice to abandon the historical battles, because presumably to advance in the campaign you're winning as the Germans? So do you make the choice to abandon the campaign, or and go completely hypothetical, or do you make the design decision to try and figure out a way to say, all right, well, we know you're winning these battles, but we're just going to keep stringing these historical battles along because that's what we know what people want to play. We know people want to play battles they're familiar with and that they want to, you know, do better than history. And so, you know, in the Russian Western offensive, for example, in the last battle that I won at the Donbass, you know, I crushed the Russian offensive. They didn't do anything. And I don't think that was the historical result. Or certainly here, if I managed to hang on to Krakow, then, you know, it's not going to, or sorry, God, I'm so bad at pronouncing words. This is the, was it Kharkov? I don't know, guys, I'm sorry. But if I win these battles that historically the Germans lost, but you keep progressing me down the historical German defeats, like, how do you tell that story? And I have a hunch Endsieg will struggle from that. This game does continue to have what the other DLCs had before it, where as the Germans you have sort of two core forces. You have your Wehrmacht forces, and then you have your SS forces, your Death Head forces, which is interesting because you kind of balance between the two. I feel like the SS rarely has an issue with money because they're a smaller core, so you can't have as many of their units, but it always seems like you've got enough reinforcements or enough sort of capacity to keep your troops at full strength, whereas the Wehrmacht is always kind of on a shoestring budget, if you will. So I think that's kind of an interesting concept. You know, in this case right now, I've got a Panther that I've purchased, a Panther A, that I wanted to deploy, but I didn't have enough capacity left in the SS to actually deploy it. And I figure, all right, well, better save the money and just refund it and not actually deploy it. But it would have been great because I've got the 378 coins down there in the bottom right to buy more units, but I can't transfer that back over to the Wehrmacht. So I think it's an interesting idea in this game is that, and it somewhat mirrors reality, is that the Wehrmacht is often struggling just to reinforce its own troops. The SS has a larger pool of money, but it doesn't help the Wehrmacht, and the SS can generally afford to have the best equipment, whereas the Wehrmacht needs more, quantity, sometimes over quality, although in this game rarely have I seen a huge benefit for going for quantity versus quality. Still, it's a balancing act that you've got to play as the Germans here. Now, as you can see here, we're getting things kicked off. We're about 15 minutes into this episode, and this particular battle starts with the Soviets on the offensive, therefore they get to move first. Now, my strategy in this battle has been to really ignore the extreme right flank. I had a reasonable starting force there, so my hope was that I was going to be able to hang on to that position with those existing troops. I based the bulk of my good troops here in the center. The briefing basically said that the enemy was going to be driving toward the objective directly to the south of the center, and that was going to be the area that I, the player, was going to have the most difficulty holding my own. So I deployed actually 2 Tiger 2 units there. I deployed 2 Panzer 4 units there. The vast majority of my armor, my anti-air units, are all being deployed here in the center to counter what is, I'm being told, will be the strongest of the Soviet thrusts. We did deploy some pretty substantial forces on the left flank as well, a little bit more infantry heavy, but we did, the remainder of our strength went to the left flank, which is also another area that the briefing said things would be challenging, but it did say that the center would be the most challenging, and that does appear to be the truth already. As you can see here, 3 Russian armor units already. I've got 4 Russian infantry units, and I will be, facing off against overwhelming Soviet numbers, most likely. I should use these woods to my advantage here on the far left of the screen. If we can get our infantry in those woods, the infantry become very effective. Armor, not as good attacking anyone in trees. Infantry, very good in defensive positions in the trees or in urban environments generally. So that's my strategy here. But you can see here on the far left flank, Soviet troops are also moving forward. Multiple armor units there. My anti-tank guns actually just ravaged that recon unit there, a 6-to-2 casualty ratio. I feel like anti-tank guns are pretty much never any value in this particular game. You can see here my secondary objectives are to shoot down large numbers of Russian aircraft, and my primary objectives, I've got a couple of cities that I need to hold. I also need to try and hold for my secondary various secondary VP cities. So there's 2 major cities that I have to hold on to win the battle, and then there are a series of 7 secondary cities that will give me a better victory. So presumably if I lose those secondary cities but hang on to the primary ones, I might win, but it'll be more like a minor victory, and the story can kind of say, well, yeah, you held on, you did well, but then after the battle the Russians still advanced, and that's why you go down the historical route. I don't know what it'll do if we win the battle, but we'll have to see. Now, what I'm going to do here in this battle is I'm going to advance my aircraft here to attack these enemy aircraft, as you've just seen. I've got 1 Stuka unit, but that's very vulnerable to enemy fighters, and I do see a lot of enemy aircraft around, so I'll probably leave that back to hopefully minimize the risk. And really, I'm going to play as aggressively as I can in counterattacking the Russian troops. Most of these German units are very good on the offensive. They're not always very good on the defensive against the Soviets, though. They seem to have a better time of it attacking. Especially true, my Tigers are going to be very good at attacking enemy units. And so my hope is what I can do is control the engagement in any given turn, focus on 2 or 3 enemy units in the center, ideally maybe 1 or 2 units in the center, and then kind of, again, focus on those, wipe those out piecemeal, and then hopefully defeat the enemy in detail. So move 2 or 3 units in on each Russian unit, wipe it out, move on to the next Russian unit, and then just over time trick down their manpower. What you may have noticed in that last attack as those Russian infantry were driven back is, despite the fact that the game told us we were likely to wipe out that Russian unit, we didn't actually destroy them all, they retreated. One thing that I feel like happens a lot more frequently in Endsieg than at least in Blitzkrieg, maybe not so much in Panzerkrieg, is that the enemy units, your troops as well, seem far less likely to just be destroyed in combat. They're much more likely to retreat, and you won't always get sort of the advertised results. So I have lost count of how many times where the enemy had 3 units left, or 2 units even, or 4 units left. In my sort of estimator there, when you move a unit up to attack, you get this little score, which is estimating, what's going to happen in the battle. I've lost track of how many times that should have meant the enemy would end with 0, and it usually is, they would have been like -2, -3, and yet the enemy still manages to retreat and survive and preserve its unit for another day. That seems to be a very common occurrence in Endsieg, and I don't know if I like it or dislike it. I feel like for the Germans, again, if you're modeling reality, they should be more rigid and less flexible. The Soviets, maybe that makes some sense. I'm kind of torn here, because what I do feel like is I feel like these more advanced units tend to destroy more enemy units than they previously did in previous iterations of this DLC. But in this one, despite the fact that they're more deadly and inflict more casualties on the enemy, they're less likely to wipe them out. I guess I don't know, maybe that's to represent the Russians gaining experience. You don't see as many of these massive pockets of Russian troops being wiped out, so yeah, the Russians should hang on and survive for another day. Maybe it's just pure coincidence. In any event, it's an interesting challenge, though, because it becomes very difficult to wipe out Russian units quickly or effectively. You often have to take an extra turn or two, and often they'll retreat behind their other units, so you end up pushing back one Russian unit only to face more sort of advanced and fully functional, fully healthy units to your front. So it's this constant drive to push the enemy back, but not actually being able to destroy them, and then being faced with new, fresh troops. That is an interesting challenge in Endsieg, at least as far as I've observed. Another thing that I will comment on is the fact that this game does a very good job of making the Russians feel overwhelming. In Blitzkrieg, it was more or less, the challenge was, how do I make sure that I keep my timetable going? That DLC pack, the enemy was a threat and something you had to deal with, obviously, but it was more about managing how your units got across the map and effectively destroyed the enemy units. It wasn't really in question that you could easily wipe out enemy units. It was more a question of how do you wipe them out without taking more time than necessary to get to all the objectives, so you can keep the timetables going, which again, if you look back to the Blitzkrieg sort of time frame, 1930, 1940, that models what was really going on. Is the Germans' challenge was keeping timetables going, but they typically would win the battles, and they just were unstoppable. In Panzerkrieg, things are far more balanced, and the Russian equipment quality is starting to come up, because that's really focusing on after Barbarossa. Once the German offensive on Russia is stopped, what does that look like? So you had battles like Stalingrad, you had battles like Kursk, where things are evenly matched or very closely evenly matched. In this, there is no question in Endsieg that the enemy is overwhelmingly more powerful than you, and that really does come across in these turns. I am successfully attacking these units. You can see we just drove back that recon unit, and it survived. You'll see here in a moment I'm going to be driving other German troops forward to try and finish them off. You can see there another battle with the recon unit, another retreat for that recon unit. But the thing is, no matter how many Russian units I seem to destroy, there always seems to be more. You can see we'll hit this enemy armor with infantry and tanks, and we'll drive it back, but now there's another line of fresh troops behind it that are, a challenge for us to deal with. So I think this game does a good job conveying that the tide has turned. The German units are more deadly than ever. They're more effective than ever. They are very experienced. You have tons of units of 3 stars, 2 stars, or even some 4-star units in these fights. But they're kind of struggling with the fact that there's just so many Russian troops, and there's so much Russian artillery. The Russians have a ton of artillery in this game, and it really does show. And again, that all sort of mirrors the historical experience that the Germans faced after Kursk, after the tide had clearly turned against the Germans, and their ability to launch counterattacks was gone, and they were basically stuck to being on the defensive the rest of the war. this game does a good job of conveying that tide turn. So I think you get a nice variance between the 3 DLCs in this series of sort of German dominance, parity, and then Russian dominance in the various scenarios. And so the design has to focus on different things. In the first DLC pack, again, it was timetables and overwhelming the enemy effectively. In the second DLC pack, I didn't play that one as much, but it was more just straight up, you gotta attack, take the objective, and you've got to make sure that you are, you're winning your battles, but things are going to be very challenging and things are going to be very tight. In this one, it's about withstanding the enemy onslaught, maintaining your forces, and living to fight another day while clinging to a handful of strategic locations that you need to win at in order to win the battles and advance to the next ones. But in that massiveness and that large Russian force that you're now facing, I do think the game has one of its major struggles, and that's the fact that these battles just become too unwieldy. There's too many units moving and fighting. There's too much going on. I take 3 or 4 minutes to fight my turn, and then I spend, 5 minutes waiting for the turn to resolve, and it's not terribly interesting. Again, this kind of a game I think works best when you, the player, are doing the actions, when you're moving around the map. When it just turns into 5 minutes of me watching the enemy mercilessly pound my position, it may convey the message of World War II on the Eastern Front in 1943 and 44 from the German point of view. So in that sense, I guess the game nails its source material. But it does get a little bit tedious at times, and I think that goes hand in hand with the bigness of these battles. Means you lose a lot of the tactical sort of ambiance that I think the earlier battles in the series have. Panzerkrieg, you have a very limited geography in Poland. You know exactly where you're trying to go. You can envision these sweeping pincers that you're moving through to try and take your objectives while bypassing large portions of the enemy army. The same thing is true about Norway. You know the objectives, you know where you need to go, and there's a very tactical sense to the geography. I would argue the same thing about the French in the Low Country campaigns. You can imagine the military almanac and its units and its arrows and its all of these things moving across the map in these very sort of precise ways that give a sense of the overall operational maneuvers. The way that these battles are designed, however, and I would actually argue the same thing is true of the early battles against the Russians. You know the massiveness of Moscow, but you can see yourself avoiding parts of the map, sweeping through, using flanking, creating pockets of enemy resistance. I did get a little bit of that in the first battle of this series, but I still feel like the problem that you get into, and maybe it will come back a little bit on the Western Front when things are a little bit smaller, but the problem that you run into is that this battle, it's a linear front, it's a large number of Russian units, there's no real spearheads, they're attacking everywhere en masse, so they've got kind of two bulky units here on the left, but it doesn't feel like pincers, it doesn't feel like armored warfare, it just feels almost like a World War I type slog, with units just trying to overwhelm other units, and there's no real sense of mechanized warfare. Again, there's very limited efforts or attempts to, create these pockets and these slashing maneuvers, and I don't think that's accurate to the Russian front in 43 and 44. I think things were very mobile. I think there were, there were these spearheads that would attempt to break through and that would succeed in breaking through, and then the Germans would have to try and close the pincer. I think it's a challenge, right, when you're trying to convey the bigness and the huge scale of World War II on the Eastern Front, but at the same time, you're trying to convey the armored slashing warfare. I think the maps need to either be bigger or the number of units need to be smaller. I'm not sure which, but I think that would be my preference on how you would get around this and get back to the early campaigns of slashing and fighting. And again, maybe that doesn't mirror the Russian experience. I'm not sure design-wise how else I would change it, but that's just my own perception. In any event, though, I do enjoy the battles. There is something to be said about seeing your tigers roll across the battlefield. Tigers do feel epic and almost invincible, and I think somewhat of an ahistorical way. I think they fit the TV narrative. I don't know if they fit the reality of the situation, but it's a lot of fun to fight some of these battles. I just think that sometimes things take a little bit too long to play out, and it feels more like I'm fighting trench warfare with tanks than it does, you know, actual armored warfare. You never really see Russian armor pierce through your lines that end up way in your rear, you know, against your armor specifically, and the armor and the infantry lagging behind. Again, it's not a tactical game, really, so maybe that's too much to ask. But if there was one thing I would try and figure out, it's that. And maybe that's why units don't get destroyed quite so easily in this game, and they retreat, and that's trying to invite you to create pockets of enemy troops. I'm not sure. Long story short, though, this is the third and final DLC pack for Order of Battle that looks at the Krieg campaign. So starting with Blitzkrieg, moving on to Panzerkrieg, and finishing up with Endsieg. You are able to bring your troops through each of those so that you can kind of carry your core force over and build up your own private army. And you are able to bring troops over from the Sandstorm DLC pack as well. This pack looks at the Russian front in 1943 and 44. It looks at the Western front in 1944 and into 1945 with the German counteroffensives there. It's an interesting new addition. It does make the Russians feel like a steamroller, and it's very challenging. And I think that'll probably do it for this first look at the new Endsieg DLC game for Order of Battle World War II by Matrix and Slytherin Games, developed by the Aristocrats, or Art Aristocrats. Anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts. Let me know, have you played this DLC pack? Is this something that you're interested in checking out? Or is this one that you're giving a pass, and if so, why? Let me know if you liked the video, and we'll be back tomorrow with another one. Until then, however, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.